saw a lot of that. I was blessed to go to South Africa and study nonviolence for a couple of weeks this past summer with two of my young colleagues. And I saw how similar the structural violence in South Africa is to the violence where I live. The color breakdown, who rides and who walks, who owns, who rents, who lives where. So we have a lot of work to do on the structural end of things, and we can't divorce it from the internal work. So I'm going to say some of the kind of clues that I've gotten over the years of how do I manage myself and other people in a way that actually manifests nonviolence. One principle is something that I like to talk about is that life is a learning laboratory. It's not a performance. So I'm not here just to perform for other people. I'm here to learn. I'm primarily a learner. And I've read some great stuff about how curiosity is a meta skill of nonviolence. So for instance, when someone says or does something that you don't like, instead of moving to judgment and dismissing them and dehumanizing them, you can instead get curious. What was it? What made this person do this thing? Even the thing that you really can't bear. Let's look for the underlying motivation. The work of nonviolent communication and Marshall Rosenberg's work has been a very useful strategy for me in doing that really difficult work of separating the doer from the deed. But we have to do that because when we dehumanize somebody, when I say, oh, that person there, they just come in every meeting and trash talk and waste everybody's time. If we dehumanize people in that way, or if we dehumanize groups of people, then that's the first step to violence. Because we can't really do violence to people whose humanity we regard with as much care as our own. So we have to do the work of looking at people and figuring out how to love. I heard Tavis Smiley speak a couple of years ago for Dr. King's birthday. And he talked about you can't lead if you don't love. So we have to learn how to love. And for me, this has been one of the ways in which I do it. When people often act in ways that break my heart, or ways in which I can't even comprehend, I have to do the hard work of figuring out what is it that led them to make those choices. I need to understand. I have to separate the doer from the deed. It's my responsibility as a person who's trying to live nonviolence in the world. Another thing that I've really liked and want to talk a little bit about is how important it is to work with people whose perspectives are different from your own. When we're in a space where we're convinced that we're the only one who knows, or we're convinced that our ideas are the ones that have to come forward, I regard that now as a sign for myself that my own internal resilience is low. When I'm in a good space, when I have the resources that I need to be able to work effectively with other people, I actually really enjoy and welcome ideas that are really different from mine. If a bunch of people who are really different from each other in terms of their perspectives, the way they think, their ages, their religions, their races come together and work on a project, and we can work an idea through our group, that's a strong idea. So you saw from some of the different kinds of people even that I work with, a lot of different ages, races, religious backgrounds, and that's how we work as a team. But that's not an easy thing to do, so which goes back to that being able to separate the doer from the deed. It's easier for us to hang around with people who think like us. And I'd like to challenge you to be willing to actually engage purposefully, meaningfully with people who think differently than you. A lot of rich stuff can come out of that. I want to put a note out. Has anybody in the here heard of a discipline called permaculture? Great, yeah. Permaculture is kind of as a combined word called permanent culture. I think of it as like a nonviolent design system. It was developed by a couple of Australians, I think in the 80s, who were studying forests and realized that forests were self-containing systems, that nobody had to bring in anything for a forest to survive and no garbage had to be taken out for the forest. So they thought, I wonder if you could figure out a way to make human systems be more resilient and self-sustaining like forests are. So they, from that, evolved a whole bunch of principles, nonviolence, or permaculture principles. And I think of this actually as also applied nonviolence. There's a lot of connections between them. If any of you are interested in sustainability, permaculture is now used globally as a way to deal with issues. For instance, in Liberia after the Civil War, and in Cuba after peak oil happened and Russia collapsed and they they didn't have any external oil. Permaculturists moved into both Cuba and in Liberia to help people have a different kind of perspective on what to do to resolve some of their problems. So permaculture is a very interesting way of thinking systemically, thinking nonviolently. One of the permaculture principles is edge effect, which is basically where two different things meet each other is where the most creativity, the most richness comes in, like where forests meet fields. That's where the most number of species will be. Or in the ocean, where the shallow water hits the deep, that's where people fish. The most life in the ocean is where the shallow, warm water hits the deep, cold water. Places where the edges are, those actually are places of a tremendous amount of creativity. I think of conflicts between people as a kind of human edge effect. So instead of thinking about conflict as a bad thing that we need to get rid of, I actually think of it as a potential resource. And for me, nonviolence isn't a way to prevent conflict, it's a way to conduct conflict. It's not getting rid of conflict. Conflict occurs when people whose voices have been marginalized speak up. Conflicts occur when people are actually safe enough to have a different opinion than someone who's in power. So actually, I'm excited to be around conflict. So one of the things that we need to do in order to feel safe and okay to be around conflict is you have to get your own operating instructions down. You have to get to know your own anger. You have to get to know your own discomfort. Where this country, and certainly in the family I was raised in, we're super conflict averse. You know, hating conflict, do anything to avoid it. But I'd like to challenge you to think about a lived practice of nonviolence includes a willingness to get to know conflict inside of yourself and then around you so that you can be more useful. It's so helpful to not be afraid of my own anger and other people's anger. I got a lot of stories of being able to walk up to people who are losing it in different settings and being able to just stand next to them and be helpful to them. It's like a very rich thing to know how to do. And the cool thing is that there's constant opportunities for practice. So even if you decide to ignore me and take this up in a couple of years, don't worry, you'll find an angry person you can work with or work with your own. One other thing I want to say about anger. I actually don't think of anger as a primary feeling. I think of it like violence itself, or like a lot of the kinds of forms of violence, as a secondary effect. Most people, I believe, actually, anger is the result of some other feeling that gets so intense so quickly that you end up experiencing it as anger, like frustration or fear. I got called in to work with some kids in a school the day after September 11th, 2001 happened, and we were just a few hours from New York City. So it was a big time. People were still not knowing who was dead and who was alive down there. It was very scary. So I was asked by a school to go in and speak with the kids the next day, and I had 20 minutes with each class. And I thought, what am I going to do? Let's talk about anger. So I went in and I said, I want to give you guys some information about anger so you can go out and be helpful in your world. It doesn't matter that you're 10. The world needs you. So let me ask you this question. A little kid runs out in the middle of the road and almost gets hit by a car. Just misses it. The caregiver, mom, dad, big brother, big sister, grandma, whoever, grabs him, brings him back over to the side of the road, to the sidewalk, and says, don't ever do that again, in a very loud voice. What's going on with this person? They sound very, very angry, but what's going on?
Scared.
They're scared. So one of your attentional homework assignments, if you choose to accept it, is to, when you leave here and you start paying attention to people's anger, start getting curious about it. When I'm around angry people now, I'm not so scared of them because my guess is that they are scared themselves or just deeply frustrated. Anger doesn't happen for things that you don't care about. So and now when I get angry, like the question I put on myself is, what am I caring deeply about that I don't know what to do to change? That's the only time I get angry now, is when I've hit that intersection of helplessness and caring. If I know what to do, I don't get angry. If I don't care, I don't get angry. But if I care a lot and I don't know what to do, that's when anger rises in me. Get to know your own anger, and it's such a useful skill on the road. I highly recommend it. When people bring me feedback about things not going well, I take it as a gift. It's so great to be someone who can be a manager or in a leadership role, and people that work with you, that are around you, they know that you genuinely want to hear the feedback. And every one of you is going to be a leader in your lives. If nothing else, you may choose to become parents. So be someone who can receive difficult feedback and be grateful for it. Now, I don't want to say that my first thought when someone sits down in my office and say, I don't like the way you said that thing at staff meeting yesterday. My first thought is not still, even after all this practice, it's still not, oh, good, all the time. But my second or my third thought is, phew, what a brave thing this person's doing right now, bringing me this feedback. They don't have to. Thank you. So I go with my second or my third reaction with a lot of these things, not my first. My first is still a condition. What's wrong with you? But my second and my third is, thank you. How can I learn if I don't get feedback? I want tight feedback loops. We need them in our world. I mean, we need them in every way we can. It's just like when you don't know how much money is in your bank account, you keep spending. Or think about like if you didn't have a tight feedback loop called your nervous system, so that when you touch something hot and it didn't quickly tell you that your hand was burning. We need tight feedback loops, even socially and emotionally between us. And not being afraid of conflict is a way to achieve that. I think if you care about the world, then one thing that we need to do is to become less afraid of being grief-struck, less afraid of being sad. Because there's so many things. The world is so much different than how I would want it to be for each and every one of you. I mean, it just breaks my heart. There's stuff that breaks my heart every day. So one of the things that I felt like I had to do in order to stay alive, not just kind of faking it, but really like able to be present in my life and useful in the world, is I needed to learn how to grieve. And I want to tell you some of the things that I found out from a very difficult time when my daughter died a few years ago, when I was really like trying to talk myself into being willing to stay alive. I want to tell you some of the things I found out about grief, because maybe someday you'll have a kind of grief that you don't know how to, you're not sure you can survive it. So here's some of the things I found out. I don't believe what I think between midnight and 5 o'clock in the morning anymore. If I'm having a thought in the middle of the night, I wait until 9 a.m. If it's still there, I pay attention to it then. But in the middle of the night, for me, that's when my darkest, hardest thinking goes on. My sense of that I can't change anything, can't do anything. So I want to give myself permission. If it's still with me at 9 o'clock in the morning, then I'll pay attention to it. But if it's just a thought that rolls around between 2, 3, 4 o'clock, I'm going to just let it be my brain doing its thing, generating thoughts. I recommend that you know what offers you solace even on your hardest days. On my hardest days, I carry a little piece of paper around with me that helps me to remember why I'm glad to be alive. And I'll bet every one of us has maybe a similar yet different list of what makes us glad to be alive. Know what those things are. So on the days when you're not really willing to be here, there's something that pulls you back. One of the things for me in the wintertime, especially that year after my daughter died, was just flowers in bright colors. So if you ever come to visit us at Gandhi House, I mean, the walls are so bright because I just can't stand dim colors anymore. They make me too depressed. So the colors in this room made me happy as soon as I walked in. And I used to go to this florist in the middle of the wintertime and just stand there and stare at the flowers until I could walk away. So know for yourself what nourishes you. Because if you're going to be willing to work on social change in the world, you're going to have your heart broken. No two ways about it. We have so much work to do. Things are so different than I would want it for any of us. So we have to learn how to survive our heartbreak and not get numb, but still be willing and happy to be alive in the midst of it. Is this making any sense with you? Just a few more things, and then I'm going to let you go. I know we're getting close. I want to say that grief and my thoughts about grief are not the same thing. So I think of grief as like weather. It's painful, but it's weather. It doesn't last. My thoughts about grief are what sustain it. So if I'm still thinking about grief, like after I've had that cloud burst of tears about this painful thing, this person's death, and in the work that I do, we just had a kid who was shot and killed, who was just at Gandhi House for a couple days before doing youth police dialogues. Our neighbor across the street from us was shot and killed last year. I mean, when when you interact with people who are struggling in the world, you are going to be someone who has to know how to deal with grief. Figure out how to get good at it. One of the things that I've really learned about a lot about and gotten really interested in is the whole issue of privilege. And I do a lot of workshops now at home for people thinking about how do we use our privilege in the world as a source of power and medicine. Because mostly people want to act like they don't have privilege. What do you mean I don't have privilege? But I'm actually excited to claim all the kinds of privilege that I have. And I'm always making up new kinds of privilege that I don't even think other people think of. I think it's a privilege to have work that you love. A lot of folks just do work because they need to, because they got to put cash in the checking account to get their family's needs taken care of. I'm so privileged because I do work that I love. If I wouldn't want another job, that's a form of privilege. There's all different kinds of privileges that we have. And one of the things that's easy for us to do is to think we can do a quick inventory of the privilege of everybody around us and act like we don't have it ourselves. So one of the things that I recommend people do to cultivate a lived practice of nonviolence is to get aware of what is my own privilege profile. Every one of us has it. Maybe we're able-bodied. Whatever it is, there's a whole list. Some of the forms of privilege that we have are relatively fixed. In general, women are going to be paid less than men in the world, and so that's a fixed form of privilege. But in some settings, it's still better to be a woman than a man. In general, brown and black people in this country have a harder time in almost every single way than people who walk around in skin this color, in general. But in some settings where I work, actually the fact that I'm this color means I don't have credibility. Look for where your privilege is and get acquainted with it. Because if you don't know what it is, if you don't know what your privilege is, then when you have a lot of it, you're probably more likely to abuse it. And this happens with people when they get power in the world a lot. So I think one of the things I want to urge you to do as you go out and become powerful leaders in the world is to get to know what your own privilege is, what your rank profile is, if you will. I want to reference a book that I use a lot in teaching at home in case any of you guys are interested in these ideas. It's by a guy named Arnold Mindell, Mindell. He and his wife Amy have written some fantastic stuff about privilege and rank. Rank being the sum of all of our privileges. And they talk about that rank is a drug. The more you have of it, the more you want. And that you're completely, most of us are unconscious of the rank that we have. So I love using my rank as medicine in the world instead of being unconscious of it. Like one example, there's a coffee shop near where I work, and I'm always mystified why the high school kids who work down the street don't use the coffee shop. But I finally figured out that the owners of the coffee shop chase those kids out when they come. So a while ago, I went in the coffee shop and I noticed a cup of coffee. I was grabbing a cup of coffee and I noticed a couple of the high school kids sitting in the corner. I was like, oh sweet, some kids are actually in here using this coffee shop. Good, right? Then I noticed a couple of police officers coming around the corner. I thought, oh, they're going to chase. So I thought, I'm going to play with my privilege here. So I walked over and sat down next to the kids and started chatting them up like I knew them, and they're looking at me like, who is this lady? And the police officer came around the corner, and he stopped and he looked at me, and I looked at the officer and I said, excuse me, can I help you? I was using my privilege in that moment to put that guy back on his heels a little bit, because he was ready to just go in there and say, you're not welcome in here, even though the two had a cup of coffee in front of them. Learn your rank profile, learn about your privilege, and learn how to use it well in the world. It can be medicine. It's not something to be gotten rid of. You know, people are often saying to me, well, I want to overcome my privilege. I'm like, you can't. It just is. It's just a thing. It's not a thing that you deserve. It's such a thing you got handed. And it's circumstantial, too. Like in the board meetings at the Gandhi Institute. When we're talking about finances and fundraising, all the young members of our board are pretty quiet. There's not so much to say. Next item on the agenda, social media. The rank flips in the room. The older people who had all sorts of things to say about finance and fundraising get completely quiet. And the young ones are like, no, don't do that, do this, we gotta do that, we gotta do that. They have it, they got it. So use and think about where you can use your rank and privilege in the world for good. Use it for healing. Gandhi messed with privilege and rank in some amazing ways. Think about it. He was the most powerful person in his country, but he dressed like the poorest. He ate like the poorest. He traveled like the poorest. Think about what it would be like if people who were in the U.S. Congress and U.S. Senate decided to live in the poorest neighborhoods of the districts that they served. If they rode Greyhound, if they took the train to Washington, what would it mean if people who had a lot of rank and privilege did what Gandhi did? It would be revolutionary. It's just one of the many, many ways in which I admire him and his choices. Just think about what it would mean. I know all of you are going to go out and be those kind of people in the world. So I hope that some of these things that I said support you to be able to work with your life in ways that are really profound and meaningful. I'm going to leave you with a quote. It's the quote that's at the back door of the Gandhi House by Dr. Martin Luther King. And one of my young colleagues set up a listening booth and took it away. He wrote, "What are your thoughts on listening?" We do these tables up and down the street where the Gandhi House is, just to engage with neighbors. What are your thoughts on listening? Especially after the shooting that just happened in our neighborhood, we wanted people to not feel so alone with it. So everything gets repurposed where I work. But the back of it is the quote I wanted to share with you today. This is from Dr. King. "If humanity is to progress, Gandhi is inescapable. He lived, thought, and acted, inspired by the vision of humanity evolving toward a world of peace and harmony. We may ignore him at our own risk." Thank you.